Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 16th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. First topic, COVID revisited. People are always for or against something, and later they pretend they were always on that side. Then history gets rewritten. It's like Orwell's 1984. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, even though just a moment ago they were allies. That's what it felt like with COVID. The left loved to accuse opponents of being Nazis or say things like, people wonder how the Nazis rose to power, then condemn the good Germans who went along for selfish reasons just to avoid disruption. But I'd flip that around. 5 years ago when COVID hit, the COVIDians, the ones who went all in on the official narrative, they completely bought in on everything. Masks, Fauci as the patron saint of science, 6 feet apart, unvaxxed equals selfish. They mocked rednecks gathering for frivolous reasons, warning about danger to themselves and others. Then the next day, the very same people were praising massive George Floyd protests. Suddenly it was noble, justified, even virtuous to pack into dense crowds because this was about systemic racism and white supremacy. The public health benefits of anti-racism protests outweighed the risk from the COVID virus. These are vague, often hypothetical frameworks, not hard science, like a virus spreading in the air. So politics trumped science. I think I largely got COVID right, not because I'm some genius, but because I could see who was lying, who was brainwashed, and who was actually telling the truth. The pressure to conform was immense. People kept saying, why make a big deal about a mask? It's just a stupid piece of cloth. But it wasn't. It was uncomfortable, unhygienic, bad for kids learning language, bad for social developments. Masks were gross. And above all, most people wore cloth masks that did nothing. Maybe surgical grade N95 masks offered some protection, but not what people were wearing in everyday life. And if someone says it's easy to Monday morning quarterback these things, and that things would have been even worse had we not taken the measures we took, to that I would just say, look at Sweden. They didn't lock down like others, and their outcomes ended up in the middle of the pack. So strict measures weren't the only path. And all these things I'm pointing out were being pointed out at the time, not retroactively. So even setting aside the practical failures, masks became a symbol. A mix of virtue signaling and submission to authority, a way to show you were a good person, someone who believed the science and cared about others. Anthony Fauci himself contradicted his own words multiple times, first saying masks didn't work, then admitting in private emails they weren't necessary, then later claiming he'd only downplayed them to keep supplies ready for medical workers. So which is it? The story kept changing. Another criticism I've heard on COVID and on issues in general is, why waste time on things you can't control? Better to focus on your own life, skills, career. Fair enough and often true, but with COVID it didn't apply, because what you were supposed to do, masks, isolation, staying home, covering your face, getting the shot, all of that had direct, tangible effects on your daily life. And the fact that I didn't go along with it all made my life better. I carried on as normal after the first month or so, while most people bent to the narrative. And my own self-education led me to a different conclusion from most people in my position, and I did not take the vax. Looking back now, the memory hole effect is impossible to ignore. One day, cloth masks were dismissed as useless. The next they were a moral obligation. Later, people pretended they had never promoted them at all. Schools were kept closed long past the point of reason, only for the same voices to quietly admit closures were harmful, as though they had never argued otherwise. Vaccines were first sold as the end of infection, then repackaged as only about hospitalizations, with the original promise brushed aside. And the way mass gatherings were treated, condemned as reckless one week, then praised as noble the next, showed how politics rewrote, quote, science in real time. That's why my Orwell comparison sticks with me. It wasn't just about COVID policies. It was about how quickly people rewrote their own history to defend them. And I should define a term, COVIDian. I like this definition. A colloquial term used, often pejoratively, to describe individuals who strongly adhered to official COVID-19 policies and narratives, including masking, social distancing, and vaccination mandates, sometimes with a degree of zeal viewed by opponents as excessive or unquestioning.
I concur wholeheartedly with the orientation Jeff has to COVID and did from the beginning. And so I concur with the thrust of everything he's offered in that soliloquy. I will nitpick a little bit, as is my wont, and offer a bit of black pill and cynicism. One of the take-home messages from Orwell, in particular in 1984, is that the people who are holding the power and constantly shifting the narrative back and forth to suit their own needs are the ones who end up with the power. It is a feature rather than a bug. And so the fact that they are consistently and continually spinning non-truths, coming to that realization did not serve Winston well. If anything, it took him from being part of the outer party where he had a pretty good existence to eventually being tortured and totally psychologically broken. And that happened to a lot of people during COVID. And there were a lot of people who sacrificed a lot in defense of the reality that virtually everything we were told and all of the dictates that came out of the wake of that about COVID were falsified. At best, truth was incidental in some cases, but for the most part, talking about Fauci in particular, he knew blatantly that the advice that he was offering was factually incorrect, but it was serving a larger purpose, and so, namely his own CYA, but it served a larger purpose, and he is going to ride off into the sunset, perhaps with his reputation somewhat damaged, but not in a way that comes even close to what anyone who suffered under the COVIDian regime would classify as justice. And the way that COVID will be described in the future in textbooks and in popular histories and in cultural shaping institutions is going to, I predict, in my black-pilling fashion, going to resemble more closely the official narrative that Jeff and I and many people listening will recognize as being virtually completely false. That is the way that it will be presented in the future. And that, among other things, should have an immediate effect of causing skepticism in the historical record on a lot of things. There are a lot of things that are presented as case closed that should not be presented, should not be interpreted that way if truth is your ultimate aim. Also, parenthetically, while COVIDian has a nice cultural purchase, I do take issue with what it is referring to, what it's derived from, which is the Branch Davidians, because I don't think the Branch Davidians were the bad guys in that situation. And if the Waco compound existed in 2020 instead of being obliterated in 1993, you can be sure that those Branch Davidians would be one of the few groups that would be unapologetically opposing the COVIDian nonsense.
While I agree that Winston Smith paid a heavy price for his awakening, for his turn against and that reversely, if he had not gone on the journey he went of awakening and he had just maintained his life, he would have ended up, at least in a material sense, much better off than he did. I'm not so sure that applies to the people who, the COVIDians. I'm not so sure if that they're better off now, 5 years removed from COVID, for having gone along with the narrative, going along with the masks. I think most obviously their quality of life was unnecessarily greatly diminished for those years, and I believe many of them are going to face ill health consequences from having been vaccinated. So while in a material sense, yes, Winston was much worse off for bucking the system, I'm not so sure the COVIDians are better off for going along with the narrative. And while there is still a lot of people who have not been adequately compensated for the harms that they were put through during COVID, whether it's small business owners or people who were kicked out of the military, although I believe the Trump administration has offered anybody who was kicked out for not having taken the COVID vax, they've offered to let them come back in, and I think even given them back pay. So there was some justice there, but people who lost their businesses, children who were adversely affected from the school closures, people who lost their jobs, all kinds of people who were pressured against their better judgment into taking the vaccine, or people who could not take the vaccine in good conscience and so had their whole lives disrupted. They weren't able to go to college or law school. So I certainly understand the black pill there. I will throw in a blue pill, though, in the form of people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being head of HHS, and Jay Bhattacharya, who is in a prominent position in HHS. He was a very notable COVID skeptic, and he's done all right.
I'm going to interject with another nitpicky digression. I think the pill there is white pill, right? I haven't seen them. The COVIDians were the ones who were blue pilled.
Yes, thank you for that correction. I'm embarrassed having being a major Matrix fan and not getting that wrong is embarrassing. But so we were looking back on COVID a little bit. Now we're looking forward. As we referenced, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the current Secretary of Health and Human Services. And earlier this month, in August 2025, HHS announced that it is winding down federal funding for mRNA-based vaccines through BARDA, BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, which is a department or agency within HHS. And this is not a minor shift. About 22 contracts worth roughly $500 million are being canceled or allowed to expire. These contracts involve some of the biggest names in the field: Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Emory University. Ongoing clinical trials such as VaxArts. VaxArt is a major biomedical company, and ongoing clinical trials like VaxArt's oral COVID-19 vaccine were told to halt enrollment entirely. The official explanation given for this massive pivot is striking. HHS declared that mRNA vaccines, quote, fail to protect effectively against upper respiratory infections, end quote. Instead, federal compensation and funding will now be redirected toward other vaccine platforms: protein-based, viral vector, intranasal, and traditional attenuated virus vaccine. And the same government that once described mRNA as the cutting edge, the future of vaccinology, is now moving resources away from it. And this comes on the heels of another important development. In June 2025, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, required updated labeling for mRNA vaccines. Based on data from 2023 to 24, the agency reported an incidence of myocarditis around 8 per million doses for the general population aged 6 months to 64 years, but the highest incidence was in young men aged 16 to 25, where the rate climbed to between 27 and 38 cases per million. And this acknowledgement, which has long been minimized and downplayed, is now literally printed on the product label.
I'll interject a quick white pill here. Looking at the stock valuation of Pfizer Incorporated, it hit a company historical high in December of 2021 when it traded just under 60. Now today, with the return of the second Trump administration, RFK and HHS, it has plunged all the way down to $25 a share, lost more than half its value since the epidemic of COVID nightmare. And at the end of the aughts in 2019, Pfizer was the single most held publicly traded stock among members of Congress. Now, I suspect that a majority of them subsequently got out before the losses were suffered, and most of them probably made a pretty penny from 2019 to 2022. But still, to see that publicly traded company and the valuations of other companies, other like AstraZeneca and other pharmaceutical companies that rode the COVID gravy train, have experienced a similar drop in their public valuations.
It's hard to imagine a better business model that Pfizer had between 2020 and 2022, where you had the biggest propaganda campaign in history, arguably, pushing this their product, and you had the government pushing the product and in many cases forcing people to take said product. So it's not surprising that their stock would have risen to such high degrees.
Another thought that's occurring to me as we're talking about this that I don't know that I have a full explanation for. I need to think about it a little bit more, let it marinate a little bit more in my head. But the typical big pharma ad on television is a joke. There have been multiple memes and jokes about how the second half of it is somebody speaking at 2x speed about all of the horrible potential side effects that accompany the various pharmaceutical products that are being offered. And we're all conditioned to hear that, and have been, and had for as long as just about anyone had been alive going into the COVIDian nightmare. And yet still, to underscore Jeff's point, most of the population not only was okay and happy to conform to the demand that the vaccinations be given and effectively coerced, but also the vast majority of the population was totally fine effectively censoring any concerns about the negative side effects, even though we had all been conditioned to assume that these beneficial pharmaceutical products that everybody was taking that were accompanied with this humorous laundry list of horrible side effects, that even with all those side effects listed, people were happy to take a whole buffet of different pharmaceutical products. But when it came to the COVID vaccine, we couldn't even allow discussion about potential side effects. Or to be more concise about it, this also underscores Jeff's observation that they had the perfect business model, because they were able to thrive when they had to talk about all the horrible things that were accompanying the products that they dispensed, but to be able to mandate a new product and not have to say a word about any of the negative side effects, well, that is a recipe for the highest stock valuations the pharmaceutical companies had ever enjoyed up to that point.
And yet another benefit that the vaccine makers were given, they were given immunity from being sued. So normally you can sue as a tort under product liability. If a product is faulty and it causes you harm, then you can sue the pharmaceutical company. That's a very standard tort law, but Congress specifically carved out an exception. So with very, very few exceptions, you cannot sue the pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer if you suffer some sort of injury from the vax. And something I realized during COVID regarding advertising of pharmaceutical companies, I had just, to the extent I had even thought about it, I just assumed it was like standard motivation for advertising, which was you want to make people, potential consumers, aware of your product and talk about how it could improve their lives. But that is not the primary motivation for why Pfizer pays millions of dollars to have ads on CNN, for instance. It is not to make the viewers aware of their products. It is to maybe subtly or not so subtly make it clear to CNN that they are not to report. They are to give only positive coverage of the pharmaceutical industry.
That observation about pharmaceutical advertising is even more acute when applied to defense and aerospace contractors. Just pulled up various Boeing advertisements, Boeing commercials that run on corporate media. In the case of something like Viagra, at least there is an ostensible reason that viewers would be interested in the product, even if that's not the fundamental intention of those pharmaceutical advertising dollars. Or more charitably, maybe they have a dual purpose. It certainly is not just to make people aware of the products that they offer, but it is also to buy favorable coverage. But that is taken to the nth degree when it comes to a company like Boeing or Lockheed Martin. Most viewers of CNN are not going to be in the market for a 737 or an anti-ballistic missile defense system, and yet still they are among the largest advertisers on TV.
Conflicts of interest run rampant in the corporate media. Most recent example on Fox News, a regular guest that they have on is Jack Keane. He's a retired American general who now works for defense contractors. He previously served on the board of General Dynamics and as executive chairman of AM General. And he is also the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, which receives contributions from the defense industry. So the idea that he would be on there and give an objective analysis of current events in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza, when he has a clear, direct financial incentive to keep the war machine going, keep it humming, keep the weapons being produced, keep them being shipped to Ukraine and Israel.
Fascism is one of the most overused, overwrought terms in contemporary discourse, but at its essence, what fascism is the melding of corporate and state power in an authoritarian system, and that is what Jeff is describing to a T.
Cheryl Atkinson is a investigative journalist. She worked at CBS News from 1993 to 2014, and then she would appear on CBS Evening News, Early Show, and sometimes 60 Minutes. She wrote a book that was published in September of 2024 that I read called Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. And she just tells story after story about how Big Pharma, which was one of, if not the biggest advertisers on these shows that she was a correspondent for, these companies, big pharma companies, would repeatedly intervene when they got wind of a story that she or her colleagues were about to break that portrayed big pharma in a negative light. And so the conflicts of interest are rampant, and more than just conflicts of interest, outright corruption and deception. Ness mentioned earlier that everybody understood that pharmaceutical products had significant side effects, and it was kind of a meme or a joke that at the end of a pharmaceutical ad, you'd have somebody talk really fast and list complications and side effects may include, and then they would list a long laundry list of horrible sounding side effects. So people understood that, but when COVID came around, they basically just memory hold that, and they pretended like their side effects weren't a thing anymore for pharmaceutical products. And I guess in a similar way, I remember hearing for years about the dangers of regulatory capture, which briefly stated is the idea that the agencies like the FDA that are supposed to be objective with a mission just to protect the health and safety of Americans, in reality, those agencies are populated and controlled by the very industries that they are ostensibly supposed to be regulating. And this idea, is my recollection, was primarily an issue that was raised by the left. They were the ones who were saying how much of an issue regulatory capture is, and yet those same leftists during COVID apparently memory hold any knowledge they had about how corrupt the whole system was. The idea that a big multi-million, billion-dollar pharmaceutical company would use bribery and other chicanery to push through a product, an unsafe product, push it through the regulatory process, that idea would be something that would be uncontroversial to these, like I said, these leftists who were talking about how big a deal regulatory capture was, but suddenly they were ready to just accept anything Pfizer said. And of course, you're a conspiracy theorist if you think that there's any possibility that something that Pfizer produced could be a faulty product.
I think that is a quaint conception of the modern left that has been largely replaced by the neoliberal ascendancy that really came definitively into power during the Clinton administration. And the idea of neoliberalism, it can sound like a nebulous term, but it is largely synonymous with the idea of the managerial state. And so the idea is there is this technocratic expert class that is interchangeable really in terms of whether it manages the state or it manages large public companies, as I had alluded to previously with the definition of fascism, the idea that those two things are effectively fungible. And so I think that was very manifest during the COVIDian nightmare that the neoliberal establishment had long ensconced itself in all of the ruling institutions in the Western world. In the 60s, perhaps, or even in the 80s, there would have been large pushback from self-described leftists to something like COVID. But as we laid out earlier, as Jeff opened the episode with, that was not at all the case with COVID, and to a large extent, there was a bipartisan support for COVID and everything surrounding it. But the leading lights, the driving force, could be more adequately described as coming from the left than from the right.
Neoliberalism has largely absorbed and integrated any genuine leftists, or they've kicked out any genuine leftists. I guess you could say that Bernie Sanders is sort of the last gasp, the last remnant of that old authentic left. And you see that a little bit. It's probably mostly, unfortunately, it's probably mostly theater, not genuine. But even like you'll see occasionally Bernie Sanders will agree with things that RFK is doing and talk about certain corruption in big pharma, but it's very superficial. And it's kind of sad. You just see like a flicker of what Ness was talking about with the old genuine left.
Using Bernie Sanders as an example of authenticity rings quite hollow over the empirical reality of how he has acted when it's mattered. Sanders has been in Congress since 1990. So if we want to generously grant that he was a true believer in the leftism prior to the neoliberal subsummation of everything that is powerful and leftist. He was never able to translate that into anything concrete. And if anything, he has been a pressure release valve that he has served, if anything, as a shepherd to allow some of those impulses, those old, I think the big distinction that we were kind of groping for, that Jeff was groping for there, was the distinction between class consciousness, or what might be thought of as old school Marxism, and the newer form that neoliberalism has adopted, which is cultural Marxism. A lot of the ideas about oppressed and oppressor are still there in the rhetoric, but they are totally stripped of their underlying purpose, which is the idea that people with means and power and cultural influence oppressed those who didn't have any of those things. And in a class-conscious understanding of the way power is distributed, that meant that the corporations and the state were the ones that had all the power, and the people, the working class, didn't. And the purpose of leftism was to address that. But with the ascension of neoliberalism and the corresponding ascension of the idea of cultural Marxism, the concerns about exploitation have been channeled in a way that redounds totally to the benefit of the neoliberal establishment. And that is where you get these 1%ers, members of the managerial elite, who happen to be women and non-white. And so the way that these injustices are putatively rectified is by giving those people power, but they're also members of the managerial elite. And so by pretending to make progress by having a female Secretary of State or a homosexual Secretary of Transportation or a homosexual black immigrant become president of the United States, the managerial state, using people like Bernie Sanders, is able to sell the idea that these leftist concerns are being met and somehow progressivism is triumphant, when in reality, meaningful challenges to the concentration of power is arguably weaker than it ever has been. At least prior to 2016, it has hit some orange speed bumps in the form of the first and second Trump administrations. Ultimately, the jury is still out on how lasting an impact those administrations will have. And even if it is right to characterize them as serious long-term challenges to the ascent of the neoliberal managed state.
Seems to me that Bernie Sanders was always uncomfortable talking about racial issues. Whenever he had the opportunity, he would pivot from racial issues and bring it back to class. He would talk about how white and black working class people, that's the grouping, not white versus black. And perhaps not in a substantive way, but more in an optics way, that idea of Bernie being uncomfortable with racial issues is forever immortalized for me in the, I believe, 2015, 2016 election cycle, when he was giving a speech. I think it was in Seattle, and a black woman came up onto the stage and took the microphone from Bernie, and he looked perplexed and didn't really know what to do and meekly just handed over the microphone. And I think that moment kind of perfectly sums up Bernie Sanders' whole career. He talks a big game about how the system is corrupt and how it needs reform, and he's standing alone and he's standing up against the oligarchy, but when push comes to shove, he gets in line, and when Hillary Clinton colludes with the Democratic National Committee to essentially steal the nomination from him in 2016, he just goes right along with it and endorses Hillary Clinton and tells all of his supporters, as Ness was saying, letting off steam. He takes all that steam and says and redirects it towards Hillary Clinton. And speaking of Hillary Clinton, Ness was also mentioning about the neoliberal women and non-whites co-opting the Marxism in the form of cultural Marxism. Back in February 2016, during the Democratic primary debate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. As you recall, those were the two Democrats finalists competing for the Democratic nomination. So at that debate in February 2016, Bernie Sanders accused Hillary Clinton of being part of the establishment, essentially saying, we need a fresh face like me. We can't just go with the same old thing, which Hillary Clinton epitomizes. And here was Hillary Clinton's response.
Honestly, Senator Sanders is the only person who I think would characterize me, a woman running to be the first woman president, as exemplifying the establishment. And I've got to tell you that it's really quite amusing to me.
And as I recall, Bernie Sanders did not have a good or adequate response to that. His old school Marxism is no match for this newfangled cultural Marxism.
That's a perfect illustration, a perfect encapsulation of the ascendancy of neoliberalism and the cultural Marxism that it employs rhetorically. In 1992, if it was Hillary Clinton running for president and Bernie Sanders was challenging, that line may have landed with a lot more purchase. But by 2016, somebody like Bernie Sanders is a rhetorical dinosaur from the perspective of the ruling Democratic Party, and it's made more so by the fact that he, senator from Vermont, had been mayor of Burlington. Vermont is the third whitest state in the country.
And Ness, can you just briefly explain the difference between traditional older Marxism and this newer cultural Marxism?
Marxism, as Karl Marx understood it, was class-based. There was a bourgeoisie, a capital-owning class, and a proletariat class. And by the nature of having control of capital, the capitalists were able to exploit the workers. It was, in essence, a competition between the haves and the have-nots. Cultural Marxism replaces concerns about material ownership and replaces it with demographic identity. In the cultural Marxist conception, the bourgeoisie, capital-owning class are heterosexual white men, particularly of a traditional, conventional religious bent, and the proletariat are everyone else. This is, of course, a trick of one of the sick ironies is this is a trick that has been quite useful for the capitalist bourgeoisie haves who Karl Marx ostensibly was going after. They are able to divert all of that energy to target it against the have-nots, the relic population, the heritage Americans without a lot of resources, while the controllers of capital make their public-facing representatives women or people of color or members of the alphabet soup identity. And so to be brief, it replaces class considerations with racial and gender considerations.
Back to the FDA in June 2025 requiring updated labeling for mRNA vaccines, primarily because of the incidence of myocarditis. I had mentioned before that the highest incidence of myocarditis was in young men aged 16 to 25. And perversely, that is the precise population that is at the lowest risk to the COVID virus itself. And so the population that it needs the vaccine the least suffers the most from receiving the vaccine. And this just gets at another ignominious aspect of the COVID nightmare, as Ness calls it, the sacrifice of young people for the potential or supposed benefit of the older generation. So the vaccine is the perfect example. Young people, a lot of the propaganda that pressured young people to get the vaccine, often against their better judgment, was bringing up grandma. Do you want to put your grandmother? Do you want to put your grandparents at risk? And so you need to get the vaccine. Or you can't go to school. You have to put your life on hold, because if you go about your everyday life, it could put grandma at risk. And it just turned the whole social contract on its head, because traditionally the parents and grandparents were supposed to sacrifice for the benefit of their children. How many times do you hear the cliche? And I don't think it's a cliche. I think it's genuine that grandparents take so much sacrifice because they're doing it to give their children a better life. And that's not what happened during COVID.
The characterization of making sacrifices for the betterment of subsequent generations, if there is a generation in American history that can be called into question with regards to, it is the baby boomer.
Yes, the baby boomers, aka the me generation.
There are plenty of reasons to indict other generations as well. To a large extent, millennials and Zoomers were happy to conform, while millennials can cast aspersions about how the boomers in their dotage were willing to turn society on its head to eke out a few more years of existence, the well-being of generations up and coming be damned. The boomers of 50 years ago would have been protesting the imposition of the COVIDian nightmare in the same way, with the same sort of energy that they protested Vietnam. And there was nothing close to a contemporary Woodstock type of movement among Zoomers and millennials as the COVIDian cloud settled over the land.
The only time the millennials showed any energy and spirit and a willingness to buck the COVID restrictions was in May 2020 after the killing of George Floyd and then the BLM riots.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's an even greater indictment of millennial generation than the Zoomers. The only thing that was able to replace their desire to utterly conform is the imposition of something that they perceived as even more important to conform to. While protests against Vietnam were real challenges to the reigning power structure, the only thing more convenient for the power structure than utterly conforming to all the dictates of COVID were the BLM protests that momentarily interrupted them.
Ness and I are believers in the utility of revealed preferences being a valuable tool to reveal truth. Briefly stated, revealed preference is the theory that people's actual choices reveal their true preferences better than their stated intentions. So in other words, instead of asking someone what someone values, you infer it from what they actually choose when faced with trade-offs.
Or in the vernacular is the idea that actions speak louder than.
And so relevant revealed preference in the context of COVID would be, what are the uptake of the latest COVID booster shots? And so presumably, if people truly believed that the vaccines were as effective and safe as officials had insisted all these years, booster uptake would be automatic. However, revealed preference shows deep skepticism. Uptake for the 2024 to 2025 booster sat at about 23% of adults in the United States, and polling confirmed this trend. Roughly 60% of Americans said they probably would not get the updated COVID vaccines. So in other words, the majority of the population is not walking the talk. Their behavior reflects declining trust. And so the unavoidable reality is that many of the people who were so sanctimoniously, self-righteously demanding that everybody get the shot, and that if you didn't get the shot, you deserve to have your life ruined and you should lose your job. As one late night show host indicated one time, if you come to the emergency room and it's shown that you were unvaccinated, you should be kicked to the curb and not receive care. This was mainstream, though those same people who were ready to ruin your life for not getting the shot, many of them are not getting the shot. And I'm not sure. I guess the capital S science has changed dramatically in the past couple years, or perhaps there's another explanation.
I interpret that as a rhetorical question, but in case it's not intended to be that, the explanation is status is more important than anything else for most people in the modern Western world, if not among all people across all time, and even more so among the elites and those who aspire to become elite. These are the strivers, as Paul Fussell coined the term in 1983, and the ascent of strivers corresponds quite well with the ascent of the neoliberal managerial class.
Finally, there is the Trump factor in all of this COVID stuff. Donald Trump has tried to thread an awkward needle. On the one hand, he still wants credit for Operation Warp Speed, his administration's program that fast-tracked the development and distribution of mRNA vaccines. However, on the other hand, he has extended cautious support to RFK Jr., the very man who is now dismantling that legacy by cutting federal backing for mRNA. And this leaves Trump in a weird position. He has to take credit for an accomplishment while tacitly endorsing its undoing.
To be as charitable as I'm able to from a Trump perspective, I'm not sure he has any other option, because if he doubles down on the belief that has entirely overtaken his support base and explicitly condemns the public response to COVID, he indicts himself. And it's easy to dismiss it as vainglorious narcissism for Trump to refuse to do anything or say anything that puts himself in a negative light. But in this case, I think it is practically really the only thing he can do. And while it might be frustrating that he still won't come out and condemn the effort that he publicly spearheaded, perhaps he is due some gratitude and grace for putting into positions of power people who made their public identity about dismantling that response and the structure that supported it. Personnel is policy, as the saying goes, and having people like RFK and Jay Bhattacharya in positions of power, his policy preferences are hard to find fault in.
Trump supporters are often accused of being part of a cult, and they will go along with anything their dear leader says. If Trump says up, they'll say how high. I think two major issues cast doubt on that theory. First is this COVID issue that we're talking about. We've talked before about a rally that Trump had a few years ago when he was casually touting his great achievement with Operation Warp Speed, and some people in the crowd at the rally, his own supporters, booed him. I think the other instance of that is more recent, is with the Jeffrey Epstein files. At least for a while, maybe some data has cast doubt on that too, but for a while his base was not letting that issue go, and despite Trump suddenly calling it a Democrat plot and bizarrely accusing saying that the Epstein conspiracy theory was concocted by Obama and the Democrats. Despite all that, at least a substantial part of the Trump base is not letting that issue go.
The point about revealed preferences is important here because in the case of COVID, and specifically with regards to the injection of these perceived as being precarious pharmaceutical products into their bloodstreams, there is more opposition, and the opposition is lasting, and it looks like triumphant. I'm more skeptical about the viability of continued emphasis on the Epstein files and the suppression of the truth about everything surrounding them. As ridiculous as the official story is, and as jarring as the Trump administration's apparent about-face has been, it still doesn't hit people in the same way that forcing them to get a shot that they are viscerally afraid of getting does.
As appalling as the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein are, they don't affect people's everyday lives. However, everything surrounding COVID absolutely affected people's everyday lives. And so it's a lot harder to maintain that outrage over Jeffrey Epstein as compared to maintaining the outrage over all the things surrounding COVID.
In responding to Jeff's opening monologue, I forgot to note the comparison of the cloth masks with the medieval hair shirt. Hair shirts were rough, uncomfortable garments made from coarse animal hair, often goats or horses. It was worn directly against the skin as a form of self-mortification, attempt at penance, especially by early Christians, monks, and other ascetics. The idea was that the constant irritation and discomfort would remind the wearer of the humility, repentance, and the need to discipline the body in service of spiritual goals. And that comparison works well with the sort of perverted religious impulse that we saw on display at the height of COVID, where we can sub in genuine spiritual concerns with a more secular concern over status and virtue signaling and making others aware of the fact that you are a good person doing good things and suffering for a just cause.
That point is further hammered home by the fact that a mask is visible, and so everybody's aware that you're wearing a mask, versus a hair shirt is worn under your clothes, so people are not aware that you're wearing the hair shirt.
Whatever its ultimate efficacy and utility, the hair shirt was a genuine attempt at virtue, while the cloth mask is all about the virtue signal. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.